Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chuck Davidson, Chairman of the National Petroleum Council, and I'd like to call the 125th meeting of this council to order. So welcome to all of you, members of the council, honored guests, members of the press. We really have a productive and informative meeting for ourselves today. Before I get started, just a quick safety announcement. With this room being on the lobby level, it's not going to be too complicated. There's no scheduled fire alarms today, so if alarm sounds, we'll evacuate through the doors at the back, and you can go either of two directions, out to the courtyard or out through the lobby, and then our muster point is at the Capitol Hilton Hotel across the street, across K Street. So again, just a reminder to keep ourselves safe. Now, if there's no objection, I will dispense with the calling of the roll, and for members of the council, the check-in inside the chandelier room there will serve as our official attendance record for this meeting. Any member or observer for a member who is not checked in, please do so before you leave, so we'll have an accurate record of who was in attendance today. We also have an extended audience with us today, joining by webcast, so that they'll be able to follow along with the proceedings with us as well. At the end of the meeting, the presentation slides and, if approved, the Arctic Research Studies draft final report will be posted on the NPC's website. Now, I'd like to now introduce, for the record, the participants at our head table. As many of you know, Secretary of Energy Moni is deeply involved in the Iranian talks. He's unable to be with us this morning as he's with the U.S. delegation in Switzerland as the negotiations continue. On my right, I'm having trouble pronouncing here, we're joined by Deputy Secretary Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, who is serving as the Council's acting government co-chair today. She is also the government co-chair of the NPC Arctic Research Committee. Liz, we're really pleased that you're with us today, both as in really both your capacities, so thank you so much. Next is the chair of the Arctic Research Committee, Rex Tillerson, who in addition to that role serves as vice chair of the National Petroleum Council. And next to Rex is Chris Smith, Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy, and next to Chris is Marshall Nichols, Executive Director of the Council. So our primary business this morning is to review the work of the NPC's Committee on Arctic Research, discuss their findings and recommendations, and vote on the adoption of their proposed final report as the Council's response to the Secretary's request. Many members of the Council have provided outstanding leadership and involvement and commitments of their own personal time and their organization's resources to help respond to the Secretary's request for advice on this very important issue. Rex Tillerson, Chair of the Committee on Arctic Research, will kick off the presentation of the results of this comprehensive study. So I'll turn it over to you, Rex.
Well, thanks, Chuck, and it really is, I welcome the opportunity to represent the work of this study group, which has been broad in its scope, deep in its investigation, and I think you'll find is going to be very useful in terms of informing a number of interested parties on the subject. If we can, though, go to the first slide. I don't know that I have control. Here it is. I do have control. Let's see if I can operate the control. That didn't do anything. Let's try a different one. There we go. Need remedial training in slide manipulation. So I think as most of the members of the Council are aware, Secretary Moniz, back in his letter of October 2013, did request the Council to conduct a study, and we've included an excerpt quote from his letter, which I'm just going to read verbatim. What research should the Department of Energy pursue, and what technology constraints must be addressed to ensure prudent development of Arctic oil and gas resources while advancing U.S. energy and economic security and ensuring environmental stewardship. So that was the fundamental question that was put before the council. I think, and as the Secretary noted in his letter, part of what prompted his request, and I think it was a very timely request, was the upcoming assumption by the United States of chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And the Secretary also, I think when he was here last meeting with the Council, also referred to the Energy Department's quadrennial energy review, which was being undertaken. And so I think obviously he felt this was an appropriate time to put these questions before the Council. So a little bit of context, I think, for the study, and there's much of this contained in the study itself, but I think there is today an increasing awareness that conditions in the Arctic are undergoing some level of change in terms of free ice conditions, how ice is changing, access to the Arctic, not just in the U.S., but globally. And so there are growing interest in the Arctic from the standpoint of what economic opportunities that may begin to open, not just in natural resource development, but in trade development as well. But a recognition also of concerns about the culture of Arctic peoples and how that is being impacted by this changing environment as well. Other countries clearly are moving forward in their own investigation and development of the Arctic nations themselves, but also nations who don't have direct Arctic territories are also moving forward with their interest in and investigation and technologies that allow access to the Arctic to be used either for economic trade or for military purposes. The Arctic does contain, I think, as many of you know, the largest remaining undiscovered potential for unconventional oil and natural gas on the globe. About 25% of the world's remaining undiscovered conventional oil and natural gas potential is in the Arctic, and a large portion of that is in the U.S. waters of the Arctic, in particular when it comes to undiscovered oil potential. The industry does have a long history of activity and successful development in the Arctic, globally dating back to the 1920s, but in particular in the U.S. offshore Arctic dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. So technology does exist to safely explore for and develop this potential, and that technology has in fact been demonstrated with developments that have progressed in the Arctic while maintaining environmental stewardship. Obviously, further development of the Arctic, I think, is recognized by most, would enhance both the United States' national security, our economic security, by enhancing our energy security. They all are interrelated. And in recognition of this interest, though, there are a number of differing views over how we should proceed, and a number of differing views over areas of concern as we further progress with development in the Arctic. And so it's really in this context that an integrated work plan with a diverse and experienced study team was needed, and that really drove how we constructed the approach to this study. So this is a reminder of the scope. I think I shared this with you when we last met. And we really broke the study into two principal components, what we called the prudent development scope, which was to provide context for then addressing the Secretary's specific questions around research and technology. And in the prudent development scope, again, we developed this context around the history of the Arctic, what has already been demonstrated. We provide both a global and a U.S. perspective, but clearly the study concentrates on the U.S. And we did make some observations on the onshore and the offshore, although, as you see in the study, we focus most of the attention on the offshore because that's where most of the resource opportunity exists today. In the prudent development part of the study, there are 4 chapters, which are shown on the right, which further develop these themes, including the last, which is policy and regulatory opportunities to promote prudent development. And I want to be clear on this, though. As all of you know, the Council is not an advocacy organization. And so when we dealt with these policy and regulatory questions, we were really looking at how does technology impact upon or enable regulatory consideration, and make some observations about how the current framework of regulations around the Arctic, we believe, deserve a review and an updating, taking into consideration how technology has changed and advanced over the last several years, and that technologies can be used to inform a review and an update of those regulations. The second part of the study, the research and technology scope then, again, the emphasis, as I indicated, was given to conventional offshore because we see that as the largest prize, the most likely economic development. And most of the observations we would make in the offshore, you could easily translate those to the onshore as well. So we looked at the research and technology needs, what the current state of technology research is, recognition that throughout the many, many decades of activity in the Arctic, research, technology development has been an ongoing quest of the industry, and that has continued on a very continuous basis. We make a lot of, in that regard, we make observations where we see additional opportunities for further advancements and recommendations and priorities for the U.S. government. So the technology and research part of the study is then divided into two subparts, and you can see there are 6 chapters. 4 of the chapters deal with what I would call the engineering, technical, and then the operating environment. And then we have 2 chapters that deal with the ecological environment and the human environment in terms of, are there additional research opportunities around species, subspecies, and are there additional research opportunities or gaps around how development impacts upon native peoples that reside in the Arctic environment and how these interact with one another. The study then was organized, as you see on this chart. I chair the study committee. Carol Lloyd, Vice President of ExxonMobil Upstream Research Company, chairs the coordinating subcommittee, and then you see the 3 subgroups around the scope that I just described. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Carol and let her pick it up and take you through a more detailed review of the contents of the study. Carol?
Thank you. Thank you, Rex. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to begin by thanking the team that I'm standing up here representing. The coordinating subcommittee, firstly, I would like to acknowledge my government co-chair, Paula Gant, who's with me here today, our assistants, Doug Hoyt and Nancy Johnson, our writing team leader, Tom Eisenberg, and our secretary, John Guy, from the National Petroleum Council. As Rex outlined, we broke the study into 3 parts, and we had 3 different chairs of those work teams. The prudent development team was led by Chevron, Mr. Bill Scott, and assisted by Stephen Laws from ExxonMobil. The engineering research chapters were led by Jed Hamilton from ExxonMobil, assisted by many different companies, notably Shell and Chevron, who led significant chapters. And then finally, the ecology and human environment chapters were led by Dr. Michael McCrander from Shell, assisted by many companies from regulatory agencies, environmental organizations in the industry. Additionally, I would like to recognize the contributions from the many companies that helped us out with significant contributions. You know who you are: the Shell team, Schlumberger, Fluor, Goldman Global Strategies, Statoil, BP, CSIS, and a special thanks to the members of our team from Alaska who traveled many miles to join us as we conducted our deliberations and dealt with the time change, many of them on the phone with numerous cups of coffee, specifically Richard Glenn and Drew Pierce, who served on the coordinating subcommittee, and they're here with us today. So team, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to stand up here and represent your work. In the time that I have with you today, I'm going to cover 4 topics. I'm going to briefly cover the process that we use to conduct the study. Then I will go into the report key findings, then the recommendations, and then I will move on to next steps. And then I'll turn the floor back to Mr. Tillerson for some further discussion. So on the next slide, guess I can do this? Yes, all right. So let me use this slide to describe briefly the process and the diversity of the team. The coordinating subcommittee had 26 team members from 20 different organizations, and you can see that we were roughly evenly split between industry and non-industry participants. Beginning in May of 2014, after we had a work plan which was agreed by the study committee, we began meeting every month, and we met every month from May until this month, even over Thanksgiving and Christmas break. The coordinating subcommittee met to deliberate on the technical work products which were being developed by the task teams and to provide steer as we worked our way along. And then later to synthesize these findings into the executive summary which we're presenting today. The prudent development team was led by Chevron, nearly 50 team members from 20 different organizations, and Mr. Tillerson described the scope that their deliberations covered. The engineering team had the largest team by far from over 50 organizations representing, not surprisingly given the topics, academia, government, researchers, the national labs, et cetera. And finally, the environmental team had 22 team members from 13 different organizations, including NGO organizations. The two research teams collaborated to host 2 technology workshops, which I'll tell you a little bit more about on the next slide. So the pie chart illustrates the diversity of the team. We had 266 participants in total from 105 organizations. You can see that roughly 40% of the participants were from industry, both from the E&P companies and the supply companies. Consultants, roughly 6%. Government organizations, both federal and state, about 30%. Alaska Natives, about 6%. NGO think tanks, about 4%. And then finally, academia, about 12%. And so overall, very pleased with, as Mr. Tillerson outlined, the breadth and the depth of the team that we were able to assemble. Talking a little bit more on the next slide about the external engagements. I mentioned the technology workshops. The purpose of these workshops were to reach out to the many people that were doing Arctic research in order to be able to fully describe and catalog the significant amount of research that was going on in the technical topics which we covered. To fully address the Secretary's question, we held a federal workshop in September at Resources for the Future. We had 54 participants, including the majority from the national labs. And a key finding from that workshop was that there's a need for collaborative studies and ongoing, potentially validation, especially in places where the industry views the technology as proven, but all stakeholders have not yet are not yet accepting of that. And some examples I would cite that came up in the workshop, which you will see in our subsequent recommendations, are capping and subsea shutoff technology as a replacement for same-season relief well, oil spill response methods in ice beyond mechanical recovery, detection of oil in ice through remote sensing, the interaction of key species with ice and with oil and gas activities, remote ice thickness measurements using detection, and then finally operations during the shoulder seasons when ice is present. Following the federal workshop, we had an Alaska workshop at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, 57 participants, the majority of those from Alaska-based organizations. The technology findings, not surprisingly, were identical to the ones that were brought up during the Washington-based workshop, but additionally, and probably most importantly coming out of this workshop, the team members that ultimately framed the report and the recommendations were provided with a deep local perspective of what mattered to the Alaskan people. In addition to these 2 workshops, we conducted 21 sessions during the course of the study's development to reach out to other interested parties that had an intersection with the scope of our report. Turning my attention now to my second topic, I'll walk through the key findings in the report. This page highlights them all on one page, so they're easy for you to see and digest. And then in the subsequent pages, I'll give you a little more color commentary on each of these in turn. So the order of the findings has been the subject of some debate, and as this is a technical report first and foremost, we put it in logical technical order. Beginning firstly with the resource potential, and then moving in finding 2 to the Arctic physical, ecological, and human environment, which we found was well understood after decades of research from multiple organizations across industry, academia, and government organizations. In finding 3, we cover the significant experience of the industry in Arctic and Arctic-like conditions, nearly a decade of experience, and the role of technology in enabling that. And then in finding 4, arguably the most important key conclusion of the study, most of the U.S. Arctic offshore is developable today with existing technology. However, technology alone is not enough, and we must also, in order to move forward, have a development that's economically viable, as we describe in finding 5, and we must also have public confidence to move forward, as described in finding 6. And then finally, there have been substantial recent technology and regulatory improvements in the area of oil spill prevention and oil spill response in ice. And these technologies are not yet accepted for use in the U.S. Arctic, opening up the door for our recommendations on collaborative work to enable that. So turning our attention to the first finding on the resource potential, as Mr. Tillerson mentioned, the global Arctic resource contains a significant portion, about 25% of the world's conventional undiscovered resources. We use the U.S. Geological Survey's assessment, and in the executive summary, we use the mean estimates, although anyone schooled in this topic will know that there is significant uncertainty. The total resource endowment in the conventional global Arctic, onshore and offshore, is shown in the figure on the bottom left. In total, we have 923 billion barrels of oil equivalent represented. Beginning at the 12 o'clock position, you can see that about 1/3 is either produced or current reserves with development plans in place to be able to access. The majority of those are almost exclusively in the U.S. and Russia. And then moving around the pie, we see the discovered but not yet developed resource potential, about 100 billion barrels, and then the produced or the undiscovered portion at 426 billion barrels. The total discovered but not yet developed and undiscovered, we call the resource potential 525 billion barrels in the global Arctic. We split that by country in the figure on the bottom right, and you can see by inspection the large portion that is assessed to be present in Russia, but considering just oil, the U.S. and Russia have roughly equivalent amounts. And the U.S. the U.S. oil potential is similar to Russia and bigger than Canada, Greenland, or Norway. When we consider the global potential and the U.S. potential, about 75% is in the offshore, which illustrates why we focused our technology assessment on offshore technologies. If I direct your attention to the second black bullet in this finding in the report, we address the question of why to pursue the Arctic now when it's remote, costly, and with current oil prices and current lower 48 production. And the answer to that, in summary, is the long lead times needed to pursue this opportunity. An Alaska offshore development would take more than 20 years, 20 to 40 years to progress. And if you intersect that timeline with the forecasted decline of the lower 48, you can see that in order to continue to maintain U.S. production at current levels, we're going to need the Arctic to do that. And then finally, as Rex outlined, pursuing this opportunity has national security benefits, energy security benefits, and economic benefits. And in the report, we identify the significant benefits of oil and gas activity today, identifying that the oil and gas industry is roughly 1/3 of Alaska's economic activity and supports 1/3 of Alaska's jobs. And then we cite the potential impact of an offshore development on Alaska, the local economies, and the nation. Turning our attention to finding 2 on the Arctic environment. In the wording of the finding and in the first bullet, we speak about how much is known about the Arctic environment after decades of research. In finding 2, we identify that the key characteristic that distinguishes the Arctic from other oil and gas operating areas is the presence of ice. And there's significant variability in ice and Arctic conditions around the world. The most important characteristics of this ice are the type of ice, the water depth, and the open water season. And I'll say more about this in a couple of slides. That variability is illustrated in the pictures on the bottom of the slide. On the left, you see a picture of first-year ice taken offshore Sakhalin Island. First-year ice reaches a thickness of about 1.5 to 2 meters each year that it freezes. And then in the middle, you see an example of multi-year ice. This is an ice ridge taken in the Canadian Beaufort Sea. Ice ridges are formed when first-year ice is compressed into sheets by wind and it refreezes. These form the dominant features that affect ice-breaking activities, et cetera, in the winter months. And then finally, on the right, we see a picture off of eastern Canada in Arctic-like conditions with an iceberg, a significantly sized iceberg. Icebergs are very rare in the U.S., but I like this picture. It illustrates the open water that's available in some of the Arctic regions. And with an open water environment, obviously, deep water technologies could be brought to bear, even though there is ice present. In the black bullet number 3, we identify that experiences from other remote and challenging oil and gas areas are applicable. And in the report, we highlight deep water technologies, for example, in terms of design practices and safety systems having direct applicability. And we also identify some of the logistics challenges associated with recent developments in West Africa and Papua New Guinea, just to name a couple of examples. And then finally, we acknowledge with regard to the environment that the climate is changing and that there are additional monitoring opportunities associated with that changing climate, with a focus on the interaction of key species with ice and oil and gas activities. And we'll say more about that when we get to the recommendations. Turning our attention to finding number 4. Finding number 3, we identify the long history that the industry has had enabled by technology advances. And this particular chart focuses on the offshore and starts in the 60s, but as Mr. Tillerson mentioned, the oil and gas industry's activities began onshore in Norman Wells, Canada in the 1920s. This particular graphic illustrates the significant technology advances that have enabled operations beginning in the 1960s through the late 70s with a focus on near-shore exploration in varying ice conditions and focusing on exploration. And then in the late 70s through to the late 90s, stepping into deeper water, further away from shore, still less than 100 meters, with varied ice, again focusing on exploration. And you can see highlighted the significant step-outs in terms of the exploration technology and drilling ships that was advanced. And then finally, beginning in the late 1990s through to the present day, stepping out into deeper water and moving from development to exploration. So throughout the technology stair-step figure, you can see the significant enabling technologies that opened up more and more challenging environments, and we would expect this to continue. Turning our attention to finding number 4, this slide describes why we assert that the U.S. potential is developable today. And this slide represents 5 tiers of physical environment found in the global Arctic. And each row on the slide represents a different technology challenge for exploration and development. The first 2 columns describe the physical environment and give examples. And by physical environment, I mean ice type, length of open water season, and water depth, as we described 2 slides previously. You can think of the first row as the easiest tier and the 5th row as the hardest tier to develop. In the 3rd column, we describe the technology implications or typical practices in that ice environment. And then you'll notice immediately that there are photos in Tier 1, 2, and 3, and there are no photos yet in Tier 4 and 5. That's because Tier 1, 2, and 3 have been proven globally, and Tier 4 and 5 have not yet been proven. Finally, you'll notice that the red text in the center highlights the U.S. Arctic contained entirely in Tier 2 and Tier 3, which has been proven by other operations around the world. Before I leave this page, I thought it would be helpful to just bring home the technology implications of the environment by walking through the photos that you see. In Tier 1, examples of ice-free conditions in the South Barents in eastern Canada. The first photo is a photo of the snow-hit subsea development in Norway. It was the first Arctic subsea development. It's 140 kilometers from shore in roughly 300 meters of water depth. It was discovered in 1984, and it started up in 2007, representing a significant technology advancement in the Arctic. The Hibernia field was discovered in 1979 in 80 meters of water. It's developed by GBS. In Tier 2, we see examples of near-shore spray ice islands, and the photo was taken in the mid-1970s, 3 kilometers offshore in 3 meters of water. And the North Star development, which is an active development in the offshore Alaskan seas. It's 6 kilometers northwest of Prudhoe Bay in 14 meters of water. It was discovered in 1984, and the oil is brought back to shore via a 6-mile subsea pipeline that's buried to reduce the risk of damaging the pipeline due to ice scour. And then finally, in Tier 3, we see a photo of the Canmar II drill ship, which was used to explore in the Canadian Beaufort in the 1980s. And traditional exploration drilling in the summer season and into the shoulder season was proven in the 70s and 80s. And then finally, we see a photo of the Sakhalin II GPS, which is a shallow water gravity-based structure. It was constructed in southern climates, floated in during the open water season, and then sunk down on the seafloor. And then that forms the basis for year-round operations, which is a typical development technology which could be used in the U.S. Arctic. Turning our attention to finding 5, we describe the economic viability of an Alaskan development, which is challenged by operating conditions and the need for regulations that reflect those operating conditions. In the first 4 bullets, we talk about the challenges in the operating conditions specifically. Arctic exploration and development is more costly than other areas due to the remoteness, the challenging climate, the short operating season, and the infrastructure. Stakeholder alignment and regulatory efficiency also influence economic viability, and although that may not be clear how, when you think about trying to operate in a relatively short operating season in the summertime, if you receive a permit condition in the middle of the summer, then you have to wait for a subsequent year in order to be able to address that permit condition, which affects schedule. In order to make an economically viable development offset these increased costs, you need a discovery of sufficient size and quality in order to advance it. And as we discussed in Finding 1, the majority of the potential is not yet discovered. So pursuing exploration in the U.S. Arctic is important. We found that 2 areas were currently limiting exploration, and those are illustrated on the bottom of the slide. On the left is drilling season length. Currently, the practice is to limit the drilling season to only the summer months when no ice is present. And in this particular example, we have 110 ice-free days. However, the back end of the season is reserved from drilling due to the requirement to drill a same-season relief well, which shortens the time available for drilling to about 80 days, as illustrated. This is an important factor because drilling an exploration well to target takes about 80 to 90 days. So this current practice requires multiple mobilizations to drill a single exploration well. The bottom half of that picture shows what could be possible with validating some of the recently developed technologies. Firstly, accepting capping stack and other technologies as a way to make safe the well, and then potentially go back in a subsequent season to drill a relief well would add 38 days to the drilling season. And then secondly, allowing the use of ice management techniques, such as have been used in other jurisdictions, would extend the season still further. So in the example, you can see that we could, with additional technologies, extend the season roughly double to what it is today, which would enable a single exploration well in a single season and roughly take the cost of exploration drilling in about half. On the right-hand side, we illustrate the challenge associated with lease lengths in the U.S., and we compare the current U.S. lease practices with other jurisdictions. You can see in the second column that the U.S. is unique in adopting what we call a development-based system. And what is meant by that is that in the U.S., in the primary lease term, which is 10 years, you have to shoot seismic, drill an exploration well, have a discovery, and then do sufficient appraisal drilling and engineering studies in order to be able to take your development to final funding and secure funding in order to request a lease extension. And that construct works very well in lower 48 examples where you have significant infrastructure, and the goal is to encourage people not to sit on leases that could be developed by others. In the case of the Arctic, where you can only work 3 months of the year, it's particularly challenging given the number of wells that would be required. Other countries have recognized this challenge, especially in an underexplored area with lack of infrastructure, and their solution is to split the lease into two. An exploration phase, and if you have a significant discovery, you're allowed to hold the lease and then enter into a second negotiation for a production lease, such as is the case in Canada. And you'll see when we get to our recommendations that we recommend the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior assess this lease term relative to the physical constraints of doing our work in the Arctic. And then finally, yes, those are the key findings in the economic area. In finding 6, we talk about the need to secure and maintain public confidence. And we identify in the opening remarks in this section that the industry and government have a shared responsibility to secure and maintain this public trust. Both the industry and government have a responsibility and a requirement to engage with the local community to understand their perspectives and years of history of working in the region. And then each of the industry and the government have unique roles in preparing and securing and maintaining this public confidence. Industry must operate responsibly and continuously improve. And in this section, we talk about risk management systems, integrated risk management systems that have been developed of recent time across the industry, such as the Operations Integrity Management System at ExxonMobil. We also talk about the obligation of industry to continuously learn and respond to incidents. And in this chapter, we identify some significant incidents that occurred in Arctic conditions or in deep water conditions that significantly shaped the industry's risk management culture and our practices, Macondo, Piper Alpha, and Valdez, and the Kulloch. And we identify that the industry and government learned from these incidents and moved on, and it's made the industry even safer today. On the government side, we acknowledge and recognize the role to ensure public safety and environmental protection and also support development. That's the definition of prudent development. And in this section, we talk about the long history of Arctic policy and regulations, and we identify the significant number of agencies that are involved in oil and gas policy and regulations, as you see listed on the slide, illustrating the need for coordination and role clarity in order to be able to move forward. In finding 7, we discuss finally the significant recent technology and regulatory advancements in the area of oil spill prevention and oil spill response. And the figure on the slide is called for obvious reasons, the bow tie. At the center of the bow is a loss of containment event, and on the left-hand side are prevention measures, and on the right-hand side are response and recovery measures. And in the report, we go into quite some detail about all the different technologies that have been developed and applied in order to prevent a blowout from occurring in the first place. And immediately on the right of the bow tie, I'll direct your attention to the photo of the capping stack and seabed shut-in devices, which are new technologies which have been developed and advanced since the Macondo tragedy. And these devices have been used in other regions, and they offer significantly improved environmental protection versus the current practice of a same-season relief well, because they have the capability of stopping the flow of oil in a matter of minutes or hours versus days or weeks or months, as is required in a relief well. And so Pursuing these technologies, getting these technologies accepted, offers significant advantages. Turning our attention to the recommendations, I've got a summary page, and then I will walk through the most important recommendations that we have in the report. In the first bullet, although the technology exists to explore and develop the resources safely today, additional research is recommended to either validate some of these recently developed technologies for use in the U.S. or to pursue technology extensions, which could lead to improvement. And as Rex outlined, although this is not a policy study, we do highlight some policy and regulatory recommendations where we have a technology link. In other words, where we've identified barriers in the U.S. that are different than other countries that, if addressed, could help prudent development of the U.S. Arctic move forward. We have a total of 32 recommendations in the executive summary and additionally 60 research recommendations in the report. And these recommendations are grouped into themes: environmental stewardship, economic viability, and government leadership and policy coordination. And I'll step through each of these now. Regarding the environmental stewardship theme, the first recommendation is that industry, regulators, and other stakeholders should work together to perform the analysis, investigations, and any necessary demonstrations to validate the technologies for improved well control. The most important of those technologies are pictured on the bottom of the slide: a subsea isolation device and a capping stack device. Secondly, government agencies should participate in the ongoing and any future industry collaborative research programs for oil spill response in ice, such as the current Arctic Research Technology, JIP, which has been underway since 2012. In particular, we are interested in the Department of Interior's organization joining this collaborative research, as they've spent quite a lot of money and time investigating oil spill response in ice. They've got some data to bring to the table, and in addition, they fulfill an independent role versus the industry. So we would be pleased to have the Department of Interior join this effort. And then finally, in the area of environmental stewardship on this page, regulators should continue their evaluation of oil spill response technologies in Arctic conditions and consider all different response options and potentially do the research necessary to pre-approve those options. Currently, in the regulations, there is a bias for mechanical recovery, and in the event of an event, one needs to move quickly, potentially considering other options that may have better environmental performance given the particular situation, such as dispersants and in-situ burning. So we recommend that research be done now and pre-approval be considered in order to be swift when we need to. On the next page, we continue in the environmental stewardship theme, and we turn our attention to ecology. The ecological environment in the Arctic is very well understood. We understand the key species that are there, and some of the populations, specifically the marine mammals, are among the most well-studied in the world. However, there is a need for additional research on long-term population estimates and the understanding of the impact of oil and gas activities and the changing climate on key species, notably Arctic cod, ice seals, walruses, and polar bears. Right now, the environment is protected by conflict avoidance agreements, for example, that the industry engages in to limit activities when marine mammals are present or when subsistence hunting activities are underway. But the thought is that we could provide better environmental protection and more flexibility for operations with better data. In the area of collaboration and coordination of ecological and human environment, we noted in our findings the significant amount of research being done in this area by a number of different organizations. And the biggest opportunity is to provide a vehicle for each research organization to know what the others are doing. And in this area, in the area of ecological research, we note the significant efforts of the North Slope Science Initiative And we also note that the North Slope Science Initiative, as part of their mandate, has a responsibility to coordinate human environment research. However, this organization has currently only about 1 to 1.5 people working on it, and they don't have social science capability. So we recommend that that be addressed in order to enable the NSSI to continue their good work in collaboration and expand to the social sciences. And then finally, in the area of socioeconomic impact assessments, in the U.S., this is part of the environmental impact assessment, and the structure around a socioeconomic impact assessment is quite, there's not a lot of structure to it. And we felt like updating it in order to provide more structure would enable more efficiency and collaboration, particularly in the area of sharing baseline data, and we make some recommendations in that regard. Considering economic viability, the first 2 bullets address the issues that I outlined in the economic viability finding. In the first bullet, we recommend industry, government, and regulators work together to validate technologies and capabilities necessary to extend the drilling season. And I illustrated in my discussion on the findings of how important this recommendation is in promoting exploration. In the second bullet, we recommend that the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior work together to assess typical timelines required for an Arctic development compared with the current lease terms and conditions in other jurisdictions. And then with the results of this good research, that could inform policy decisions and regulatory decisions as warranted. And then finally, we recommend that policy, regulations, and implementation encourage innovation and enable the use of technology advances. And the Department of Interior has some capability in this regard, but for an individual regulator, there's significant risk in exercising this flexibility. And we make recommendations in the report for Arctic training to enable the use of this flexibility that already exists. And then in the third theme, the third and final theme, government leadership and policy coordination, we consider domestic leadership and then recommendations for the Arctic Council on slide 19. We note the Arctic Executive Steering Committee that was recently formed by executive order. We think that's a significant step, suggesting coordination of 22 federal agencies at the deputy secretary level, which we think will be a step change in coordination. And we make recommendations for that initial body as it gets formed to reaffirm commitment to prudent oil and gas developments, assess alignment across federal agencies with regard to that objective, and then clarify the process by which it will engage with Alaskans. We also note the Arctic Executive Steering Committee has, as part of its requirement, a gap analysis that's due in May, and we make some recommendations that the Executive Steering Committee should consider as part of that gap analysis, those being a comprehensive and integrated list of regulatory requirements, and then an assessment. The Interagency Working Group is doing a great job of coordinating permit requirements in the Arctic, and we thought that that group in particular could have some insight into the difficulties in setting up a coordinating body in some of the areas for improvement. And we recommended that the Arctic Executive Steering Committee talk to that group for some insights as part of their gap analysis. And then finally, regarding the Department of Energy's participation in that group, we make some recommendations that we felt would better facilitate the Department of Energy's participation. Considering the Arctic Council, prior to the U.S. chairmanship, the Arctic Council has entered into 2 international agreements on the important topics of search and rescue in 2011 and oil pollution preparedness and response in 2013. These are very important topics, and if there's an incident in the Russian Arctic, the U.S. Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, they enable cross-border collaboration. So we're moving now into response exercises, and upcoming the Arctic Council plans a desktop exercise first and then a field exercise, and the industry has a lot of experience in response, safety and oil spill response. And so we would like to engage and participate in that. And then finally, the Arctic Economic Council is a relatively new body that's just been formed, and we recommend that the Arctic Council strengthen the interaction with the Arctic Economic Council as a vehicle to provide business perspective as well as environmental perspective to the Council. Turning our attention to my fourth agenda topic, which is where we go from here. Subject to the Council's comments and approval, we are ready to turn the digital communications live this afternoon. You can see a photo of the report cover on the right-hand side. There will be a digital copy of the executive summary, and there will also be other related materials available. The Council webcast will be available. There'll be a schedule of forward events, and I'll say more about that in a second. And then finally, at the suggestion of the study committee, we worked with the National Petroleum Council to think about how we could update our communications to make them more social media friendly. And so you can see right at the bottom of the slide, the NPC now has a Twitter account. So for those of you that are active in Twitter, you can follow and hear some great insights from Marshall Nichols and his team. We are making great progress in making our printed version available. I'm very pleased with the initial typeset version of the executive summary. We are indeed in a great spot, and our printers have told us that the printed volume of the executive summary will be available in mid-April, and the full report will be available by the end of May. And then finally, on the last slide, just a little bit about communications. Yesterday, prior to the meeting, Mr. Tillerson and Ms. Sherwood-Randall held 5 briefings with Senate, White House, and House leaders in order to provide a perspective on the report so they would be ready to receive it. We have also provided some pre-briefing with the staff to tell them about the report in the interests of getting the word out that this was coming. And then subsequent to hopefully the approval here today, we have plans to travel to Alaska to meet with some of the state leaders and the community leaders in the first week of April. The CSC leadership team will be making that trip. CSIS has volunteered to host a panel discussion in Washington on April 17th, and we look forward to that public event. Other Washington and Alaska communications are going to be conducted during April, and we've also made a commitment to participate in the Energy Council meeting in Santa Fe in June with potentially a panel discussion. And I believe there's also an event hosted at RFI, Resources for the Future, on April 1st coming up. So we will continue to receive requests for communications, and they will continue to be noted and followed up on by the NPC staff. After we get through the initial rollout, there's a protocol for ongoing communications, which I've highlighted. Any individual can use the NPC Arctic Research Report in expressing their own views, provided they cite the report. And if the request does not originate through the NPC, please let John Guy at the NPC know of the request, provide the name of the presenter and a copy of the presentation or report, and please be mindful of the purpose of the council and the prohibition against lobbying. Post the meeting, we will have available these slides and some shorter versions of the presentation for your potential use as you move forward and make your own presentations in that regard. Once again, thank you very much to my team, and thank you to the council for your support for this opportunity and for your time and attention this morning. Mr. Tillerson?
So in keeping with suggestions at the last study committee meeting that we become a little more up to date with our modes of communication, it was also suggested that we investigate producing a rollout YouTube video, which we have done. And if we have it loaded, we thought we would play that for you so you can see what's out there, or will be out there as of today.
The National Petroleum Council was established in 1946. The Council is a privately funded advisory committee to the Secretary of Energy. We operate under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. From the beginning to this day, the sole purpose of the Council has been to provide the advice of the members, upon the request of the Secretary, to the federal government on any matters relating to oil or gas or the oil and gas industries. We receive no government funds, and when studies are established, we will pay for those costs from funds provided by the members. The Council is not an advocacy group. It is not involved in any of the usual trade association activities, and it does not lobby.
The Arctic Research Study is being undertaken by the National Petroleum Council to address questions regarding what research and technologies would help provide support for prudent development of our Arctic oil and natural gas resources. The Arctic region is the world's largest potential for undiscovered conventional oil and natural gas.
It's been a very collaborative effort across federal agencies and people in the state of Alaska and the industry to bring together all of the expertise and experience we have in operating oil and gas development in that region.
What excites me about this report is the collaboration. It really brought together a wide spectrum of experts, not only from the energy companies, but from the think tank community, environmentalists, experts, academics. It brought us all together to try to figure out the question, how can we safely and responsibly and prudently develop the American Arctic? What are the obstacles? What are the opportunities? How does this impact indigenous communities?
To realize the promise presented by our domestic oil and gas resource in the Arctic will require that we continue to develop and demonstrate technologies and practices that allow the public to have confidence that the resources can be developed in a prudent manner. And many of those important steps are pointed out in this study.
The industry has a very long history of development in the Arctic, and the Arctic is an important source of supplying natural gas and oil to the world's energy needs today.
So essentially we've seen continued activity from the 1920s to almost the 2020s. So we've considered safety, human health, environmental stewardship and sustainability balanced with economic growth.
In this document, it's going to go to the Secretary of Energy. There's a lot of balancing interests. There's the balance between conservation and resource development. There's the balance between traditional knowledge and what we call Western science and engineering.
Traditional knowledge is an important aspect of operating successfully and responsibly in the Arctic. First of all, you have to recognize that the people of the Arctic have been there for thousands of years with a very close relationship with the environment that they live in. Recognition that they have this knowledge and gaining the ability to access that knowledge and utilize it to improve our understanding is an important aspect of being successful.
And we did a lot of work to try to listen to those points of view and concerns. And when you look ultimately at the report, I think most people will see there is an enormous amount of information that is responsive to those ideas, those suggestions, and even some of their recommendations.
There are three findings which I'd highlight as most significant. Firstly, there is substantial resource potential in the Arctic, both globally and in the U.S. Secondly, this U.S. potential can be explored for and developed safely while maintaining environmental stewardship using existing field-proven technology. Finally, there have been substantial recent technology improvements in the area of oil spill prevention and oil spill response in ice.
The Arctic is our home. We're not going anywhere. And so if development comes to our area, we want to benefit from it while it's there, and we want to make sure that we mitigate any negative impacts that might happen. Do we get passionate about it? You bet we do.
Okay, so, Mr. Chairman, at this point, I would move adoption of the Council's Arctic Research Study and would welcome any discussion from the Council members, comments or questions that the Council members may want to raise during this portion of the consideration.
Thank you very much. Rex, Carol, what a great job. You and the study groups have really assembled a very comprehensive report, and I'm pleased that that you've taken on the challenge of finding a different way to communicate the results. I think that video, which by the way was done very quickly. It was in the last committee meeting that it was suggested, so true to council's form, we can move quickly, and it's really a nice additional way to communicate the results of this study. I do have a motion that the National Petroleum Council approve the report, subject, of course, to final editing, and approve the transmittal letter to Secretary Moniz and make available to public through the NPC website. Before we have any discussion, could I have a second on this motion? Got a second? Thank you. So at this point, are there any comments or questions from the council members on the proposed final report? We've got some microphones available if you'd like to have a question. I think we're seeing, right, Marvin? Yes, yes, right here in the front.
So just a comment to also, on behalf of, I know, a number of people, say thank you and congratulations on what I think is a terrific study. I think there was an enormous need for a comprehensive look at this topic, and this provides a great go-to source for the many stakeholders that are interested in this area. So it's just a voice of support.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we have a motion and a second to adopt the proposed final report of the NPC Committee on Arctic Research. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? The report is adopted without objection. And once again, thank you, Rex. Thank you, Carol, who's smiling widely right here. Members of the committee, chairs of the subcommittee and the subgroups, the multitude of volunteers that have helped complete this work. This report does provide a very significant amount of information to policymakers as they deal with near-term issues at hand, as well as many of the long-term issues that need to be addressed now as we go forward. It's going to be an important resource to those who are students in the Arctic and those who will be dealing with Arctic development issues around the Pan-Arctic region. And I would, just as a side note, comment that this now concludes two requests that the Secretary had before the National Petroleum Council. The first, which we approved last December, which Marvin Odom led the group on emergency preparedness, and now this one on Arctic research. And I think what strikes me in stepping back and looking at both of these reports is they really demonstrate the value added that National Petroleum Council provides to not only the Secretary of Energy, but really to this country, because this is a very unique organization. When you think about the report that we just approved that involved 250 members, over 90 organizations, it's hard for me to really find an equivalent organization that can pull together such a comprehensive report on a diverse set of topics such as emergency preparedness or the Arctic, do those virtually in parallel and produce very comprehensive, incredible results that reflect the opinions and the inputs of a diverse cross-section of our industry. So I think we should all be proud of our involvement in National Petroleum Council, and to really see here today demonstrated what we can do to help energy development and to make informed advice to the Secretary of Energy regarding energy issues. So, Madam Deputy Secretary, it's with great pleasure that the National Petroleum Council submits this report to you in response to the Secretary's request. The effort went into it. I won't repeat all the specifics, but obviously many organizations. So it's with great pleasure that we present this to you.